I'm Michael Stanislawski, Chair of CC, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the second and last course-wide lecture for this academic year. I'm delighted that our speaker accepted our invitation to come because I had wanted to have him and hadn't had the chance to invite him for all of the 4 years that I served as chair of CC. So this is my last one too. But all I get to do is to introduce. So Robert Richards is the Morris Fishbein Professor of the History of Science and Medicine at the University of Chicago. He is a member of the Departments of History, Philosophy, and Psychology, and Director of the Fishbein Center for the History of Science. His research spans the breadth of the history and philosophy of psychology and biology, with specific interests in evolutionary theory, in biopsychology, ethology, and sociobiology. He has written several books on the impact of evolutionary theory and on German intellectual thought, including The Tragic Sense of Life, Ernst Haeckel and the Struggle Over Evolutionary Thought, which was published just a couple of years ago, The Romantic Conception of Life, Science and Philosophy in the Age of Goethe, The Meaning of Evolution, the morphological construction and ideological reconstruction of Darwin's theory, and Darwin and the Emergence of Evolutionary Theories of Mind and Behavior. Currently, Professor Richards is co-authoring a book entitled Debating Darwin with Michael Roos. So I'm delighted that he can come here and debate Darwin in front of us, with us, and please turn the podium over to him.
Well, I hope we will indeed have something of a debate. I'm delighted to be here at Columbia. Columbia University is one of the significant universities in the United States, along with the University of Chicago, that takes liberal education quite seriously. And this is certainly an example of the seriousness with which you take this kind of education. In the preface to his play, Back to Methuselah in 1921, George Bernard Shaw expressed his century's growing fear of that terminating machine of Darwinism. Shaw wrote, "You cannot understand Moses without imagination, nor Spurgeon, who's a famous preacher of the day, without metaphysics, but you can be a thoroughgoing neo-Darwinian without imagination, metaphysics, poetry, conscience, or decency. For natural selection has no moral significance. It deals with that part of evolution which has no purpose, no intelligence, and might more appropriately be called accidental selection, or better still, unnatural selection, since nothing is more unnatural than an accident. If it could be proved that the whole universe had been produced by such selection, only fools and rascals could bear to live." Well, one of those rascals who seems to be able to take it is Dan Dennett, a prominent philosopher of science. In his book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, Dennett affirms Shaw's characterization of Darwin's accomplishment. He writes, "Darwin explains a world of final causes and teleological laws with a principle that is, to be sure, mechanical, but more fundamentally, utterly independent of meaning or purpose. It assumes a world that is absurd in the existentialist sense of that term, not ludicrous, but pointless. And this assumption is a necessary condition of any non-question begging account of purpose." Now, this is a quite common assessment of Darwin's accomplishment. And when you have opportunity to take up at least portions of The Origin of Species, you're going to come to that book, I suspect, with a mindset that has already been preconditioned to think about Darwin's accomplishment in these terms, namely that Darwin banished notions of purpose and teleology from the scientific understanding of nature, that he introduced blind mechanical processes to explain the descent of species. In his world, human beings, at least you will assume this, I presume, have no special place. Indeed, our evolution is assumed to be highly contingent. It could have been the case that at the present time only cockroaches inhabited this world. that our presence here is simply an accident. Now, I don't think that Shaw and Dennett are correct, and what I'm going to try to argue with you today is that in the Darwinian world, one can still hear the sweet birds sing. Darwinian nature, at least as originally conceived by its author, is not bereft of moral values, as both Shaw and Dennett presume. Indeed, this is the common presumption of both opponents and supporters of Darwinian evolution. I rather think that Darwin demonstrated the power of mind in nature. Darwin was indeed an individual who ushered in the modern world, but I think what needs to be stressed is that he was also one whose values, assumptions, and whose science was formed in the pre-modern world of the early part of the 19th century. So let me briefly attempt to show you that Darwin constructed his theory using conceptions of a rather traditional sort. And when one comes to understand what the instruments of his construction were, the whole Bauplan appears, I think, in a rather different light. Not quite so harsh or as impervious to human aspirations, not quite so meaningless as Shaw and Dennett believe. So, what were the instruments of his construction, of his theory? Well, first of all, teleological causality. Now, I presume that given your experience in the core curriculum that you followed, the ideas of Aristotle are not at least too distant from your intellectual horizons. So teleological causality is one of those kinds of causality that Aristotle introduced those centuries ago, but was assumed by Dennett and many others to have been banished from the repertoire of biologists, certainly by the time you get to Darwin, and Darwin himself is purported to have excluded appeals to teleological causality in order to understand the operations of nature. What I'm going to argue is that Darwin's theory does not dispense with teleological notions, that human beings are, as it were, the trajectory toward which nature is aiming, at least that's the way Darwin constructs it, and that there is a deep moral character to Darwin's understanding of nature. Now, Darwin obliquely expresses this trajectory in that famous peroration that concludes The Origin of Species. As he says, from the laws of variability, divergence of character, and natural selection, these are the laws that he has discriminated in his book, The Origin of Species, he assumes the most exalted object which we're capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows. There's grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been breathed originally into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed laws of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. The most exalted object which we're capable of conceiving is us. We are that highest animal. Human beings, particularly with their moral sentiments. That's to say, man as a moral animal, I think, is the teleological goal of nature as Darwin's theory constructs it. Now, needless to say, perhaps, this is not the usual picture of Darwin's accomplishment. He's most often represented by the likes of Michael Giesland, Stephen Jay Gould, Richard Lewontin, Richard Dawkins, Michael Roos, Dan Dennett, and a host of others as having banished teleology from nature, as having constructed natural selection as a blind mechanistic process that eradicated the least tincture of non-selfish behavior from human beings. An exemplar of this kind of attitude is that of Michael Giesland, who so delicately put it, in the Darwinian world, scratch an altruist and watch a hypocrite bleed. While the aforementioned scientists and philosophers emphasize the dysteleology and amoral implications of Darwinism, there are some, like Philip Kitcher here at Columbia, or George Levine, whose last book bears the title Darwin Loves You. These are individuals who think there are replacements for what Darwin seems to have swept away, namely a structure of scientific and philosophical considerations that pump meaning back into life and leave human beings as intrinsically ethical creatures. Now, I would generally cast my lot with Phil Kitcher and George Levine, but not entirely, since they too have been ready to accept what I take to be the neo-Darwinian interpretation of Charles Darwin's theory. And perhaps it's needless to say, but bears saying again, Darwin was not a neo-Darwinian. As I mentioned, I believe Darwin, in fact, constructed nature as having a goal, an end, human beings as moral creatures. Moreover, he advanced a view of human nature that made human beings authentically moral creatures, not hypocritically selfish with a facade of altruism, but as deeply authentic altruists. Now, before detailing the argument for these conclusions, let me just say a few brief words about Darwin's early life. Darwin was born in 1809. He was the son of Robert Waring Darwin, a rather well-known Shrewsbury physician. He was the grandson of the even more famous Erasmus Darwin, who himself had developed a theory of species change. Darwin followed his grandfather, his father, and his elder brother to Edinburgh Medical School in 1825. Charles lasted only 2 years at Edinburgh. It was a dreadful experience. In his perfectly charming autobiography, Darwin recalls the horror of rising very early in the morning and taking lectures at 8 o'clock on materia medica on a winter's morning in Edinburgh. That was enough, along with some experiences he had of open surgeries without anesthesia. Anesthesia hadn't been developed at this point. That after 2 years he had enough and he came down from Edinburgh without a degree. He was a great disappointment to his father, since the family traditionally had gone to Edinburgh and had produced a number of prominent physicians. In his autobiography, Darwin recalled that once his father said to him, "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat catching, and you'll be a disgrace to yourself and all your family." Darwin quickly added, "But my father, who was the kindest man I ever knew, and whose memory I love with all my heart, must have been angry and somewhat unjust when he used such words." After failure at medical school, Darwin enrolled at Cambridge University with the vague idea of becoming a country parson. He spent most of his time at Cambridge in pursuit of those things his father had warned him against, mostly going to dinner parties, but collecting beetles. Darwin recounts in his autobiography that he had no systematic purpose in collecting beetles. He just liked to collect bugs. He tells the story of one afternoon, late afternoon, when he was in the backs behind Christ College at Cambridge, and he saw a beetle and he picked it up because it looked like a wonderful addition to his collection. And then he saw another one and picked that up, and on his way back to the college, he kicked over a stone and saw one that he simply could not dispense with. And then the one in his right hand, he popped into his mouth to pick up the other one, but the one in his mouth exuded some acrid fluid, and he lost all 3 beetles. Well, he simply indicates that to suggest the avidity with which he collected beetles. When Darwin was a senior at Cambridge, he had by chance read the autobiographical reminiscences of Alexander von Humboldt. Humboldt had traveled to the New World in 1799 and wrote of it in a multi-volume autobiography. Alexander von Humboldt was a protege of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and he was a prominent and eminent scientist. But he was also a romantic adventurer, and when Darwin picked up these volumes, he himself was inspired to think about the possibility, this very parochial lad, about wider horizons. He certainly didn't really harbor much hope of exercising those desires, But as chance had it, the opportunity came to ship out on a boat that was going to ply the coasts of South America to chart the waters for British merchant shipping, HMS Beagle. And Darwin eventually was hired. Actually, hired is the wrong way to put it, because he had to pay his own way to act as naturalist and companion to the mercurial captain of the ship, Robert Fitzroy. Fitzroy was a manic depressive man, and Darwin never quite got on his good side. Darwin's father had to pay the freight, though, because this was something that he was not hired to do. In order to go, Darwin's father had to come up with some cash, and that immediately constrained him, and it took a great deal of convincing and coaxing to allow Darwin to take the trip. The trip was to be for 2 years. It was going to go from England to South America to chart the waters off the coast of South America, a trip around the world ultimately. It was to last 2 years, but wound up going over a period of almost 5 years. During the time that Darwin spent on the Beagle, his biology would appear to have remained perfectly orthodox. That is, he believed in the stability of species. He collected a number of specimens. That is, the ship would dock at various ports on the coast of South America, and Darwin would get on his horse or donkey, depending on what was available, go inland. He would do some geologizing. He would collect specimens, flora and fauna, pack them up, and send them back on merchant ships back to England in the British Museum. When Darwin returned, after visiting, for example, famously the Galapagos Islands, he nonetheless, as I say, probably remained orthodox in his biology. It was only after he returned and he started cataloging his specimens that he began to think about the possibility of species change. When he was describing his mockingbirds, 3 varieties of one species, when Darwin went to the Galapagos, he was persuaded that the Galapagos were volcanically produced. These were volcanic islands, and he thought them to be about 1 million years old. Now, by the time Darwin is writing, geologists of the period had already decided that the calculations of the age of the Earth, of, say, 6,000 years by Bishop Ussher, were really quite ridiculous, and that most professional geologists recognized that the world was very, very old, and Darwin's own estimate of those islands was about 1 million years old. And pretty sharp he was, because we now think them to be about 1.5 million years old. He conceived that the animals on the islands, mostly birds, lizards, tortoises, that they probably came over from the mainland. The birds may have gotten blown over by some storm and landed on the various islands and had lived there for eons. One of the characteristics of birds on the Galapagos, if any of you have traveled to the Galapagos, you know this quite well. The birds have no fear of human beings. If you're walking along a path on one of the islands, some birds may be in the way. You have to step over them. They don't get out of your way. Darwin, in collecting specimens, could do it quite easily. He would just go up to a tree where a hawk or a mockingbird happened to be sitting, take the butt of his rifle, knock it on the head into a bag, and then take it back to the ship, and then prepare it in spirits of wine to be sent back to England. So the birds were quite tame. But these mockingbirds, Darwin thought, that probably in the long distant past, one species got blown over to the island, and they settled on various of the islands. And because of the impact of the environment, the varieties changed. Now, within the biology of the period, it would be perfectly orthodox to maintain that environmental changes could induce morphological changes and produce new varieties within a species. But the species barriers themselves could not be breached. When Darwin got back, he was cataloging his specimens and consulting with John Gould, one of the world's leading ornithologists at the British Museum. And Gould said that these birds were not varieties of one species. These were good and distinct species. This obviously tripped a mind at the ready. Darwin had been perfectly cognizant of earlier attempts to formulate a theory of species change over time. His own grandfather Erasmus had produced such a theory. More famously, perhaps, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck had constructed such a theory. Darwin himself was not original in maintaining or arguing that species changed over time. But the views of these two individuals had been derided. They were not accepted at all in the intellectual communities of Britain and France. But now Darwin, primed with the knowledge of his mockingbirds, which he had a good theory about how they got on the islands and how they changed, but now he saw the change to have been more drastic. And so with the background of his grandfather and Lamarck's ideas, he began to formulate for himself notions of species change. He first explored what would be the causes of this change. And initially, Darwin had what we would take to be Lamarckian notions of the causes of such change, namely the effects of the environment which are inherited by groups of organisms which pass them on to their offspring. So this is a view of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Darwin never let go of that idea. Darwin was, in one way, we would think of as a very conservative thinker. That ideas once formulated, he never really abolished, though he transmuted them in several ways. So from the beginning of his career to the end, Darwin believed in the inheritance of acquired characteristics. That's not something that he dismissed. But in 1838, in late September of that year, he picked up, as he said, for amusement, Thomas Malthus's essay on the principle of population. Now, Darwin, as I said he picked it up for amusement, indicating he had a very low bar for amusement. That book led him to formulate what we now know as the principle of natural selection. Very early in Darwin's theorizing, he had been aware that the breeder's picking or choosing could transform the structure of animals and plants, but initially he had no way of conceiving how that process might take place in nature. What Malthus provided was the notion of species pressure, namely that more individuals are born in a generation than can possibly be supported by the environment, which meant, as Darwin conceived it, that any slight trait that an organism might have that gave it an advantage over others of its generation would allow that animal to have a better probability of reaching reproductive age and passing those traits on to offspring. And this essentially is the idea behind natural selection. Now, this is the usual way in which Darwin's theory is put, and it's certainly, I think, the case. But below that is a deeper structure, and it's that deeper structure that I'd like to try to expose today. Just to keep you aware of his trajectory, from 1837 to 1842, Darwin kept a series of notebooks in which he was working out his notions of species change. And these notebooks, rather prosaically, are called the B, C, D, and E notebooks, as well as notebooks M and N. In 1842, he sits down to write an essay, which is going to be essentially the essay that is the foundation for the book Origin of Species. This is about 35 manuscript pages. 2 years later, he writes out a much longer essay, developing ideas that are nascent in the first essay. He has a fair copy made. A fair copy is a copy that a printer could use to print a book. And he leaves 400 pounds in his will that should he die before this growing theory was announced to the public, that posthumously the book could be printed. So he leaves 400 pounds, but Darwin lives, and lives a very long time. From 1848 to 1854, Darwin gets sidetracked. He wants to give a description of a barnacle that he discovered on his voyage, and he winds up describing all the known extant barnacles and extinct barnacles available through the paleontological record, and produces ultimately 4 large monographs on barnacles. This is a kind of sidetrack that if you go to the university library, you can still find his volumes there, and they're probably still the last word on the description of barnacles. In 1856, he sits down to start working on his theory and to write it out in a large manuscript. And from 1856 to 58, he produces a manuscript that the pages are piling up. He was going to call it Natural Selection, and had he finished it, it would have been at least a 2, maybe a 3-volume work. But in 1858, he got a letter from an obscure naturalist working in Borneo, Alfred Russel Wallace. And in the letter, Wallace says, you know, I have a notion about species change. And he included a little essay. And he writes Darwin, Mr. Darwin, if you think there's anything to this, would you communicate this to Sir Charles Lyell? Lyell being one of the most prominent scientists of the period and a friend of Darwin's. When Darwin read the essay, he about died. He said, it's as if Wallace were standing behind me and reading over my shoulder out of my notebooks. The theories were so similar. Darwin was crestfallen. He thought his originality had been swiped from him, and he thought that honor required him to stop working on his own theory. His friends had to convince him, and probably they didn't have to convince him too much. No, we know you've been working on this for a long time. And they arranged to have Wallace's essay and passages out of Darwin's 1844 essay read to the Linnaean Society. It was pretty clear, given the dating of Darwin's essay, and they made sure that that dating was pretty prominent, that Darwin had really gotten there first. The essays were read before the Society. They were printed in the Society Journal. At the end of the year, the secretary of the Linnaean Society summarized the activities of that year, and he said, a pretty dull year. Nothing important has happened. Well, Darwin then quickly compresses this large manuscript that he is writing. He got to about what amounts to chapter 7 of The Origin that we have, and that he adds the rest of the chapters, and in 1859 he publishes The Origin of Species, calls it an abstract. In the 1860s, he works on the variation of plants and animals. That is, he wants to try to figure out how it is that animals spontaneously seem to be variable as they are born. And in 1871, he attacks a problem and a topic that he had purposely neglected in The Origin of Species, and that is the evolution of human beings. If you've read any of The Origin, you know that Darwin does not talk about, except in one rather limited way, about human evolution. He made a decision that he did not want to talk about human evolution in The Origin because he thought that everybody would focus on that and that it would distract from the arguments that he was making for the reality, generally, of the evolutionary process. Well, as soon as The Origin was published, of course, all the reviewers focused only on what the implications were for human beings. So he was thwarted in that respect. And finally came out with The Descent of Man in 1871. Now, if we go back and look at some of his early notebooks, I think the structure of The Origin becomes much more obvious. So here is a passage from his e-notebook in which he writes, and here he's working on a certain problem. It's a problem that biologists today are still quite curious about, and I suspect many in this audience are even curious about. And the problem is, why is there sex? That is, a more primitive form of reproduction is what we would call clonal reproduction, that is, asexual reproduction, budding, fission, and so forth, engaged in, for example, by a lot of invertebrates. So the question is, why wasn't that the predominant mode of reproduction? What is the origin of sexuality? And in his notebook, Darwin speculates about this, and he forms an argument. And this is the argument. He says, my theory gives great final cause of sexes, for otherwise there would be as many species as individuals. And what he seems to have thought is that through asexual reproduction, each individual would be like an individual species. And he goes on, if all species, that is, if all individuals were species, then there would not be social animals, which, as I hope to show, is the foundation of all that is most beautiful in the moral sentiments of the animated beings. If man is one great object for which the world was brought into present state, that is, one great purpose for which the world was brought into present state, and if my theory be true, then the formation of sex is rigidly necessary. Now, this is a perfectly teleological argument. Sex came to exist, sexual reproduction, in order that there be social animals. Social animals came into existence in order that there be moral animals. And of course, the moral animal is us. That is, his theory indicates the great object of all this, namely the object for which the world was brought into present state, namely human beings. Now, if we dig down into the layers of the origin of species, for example, if we start off with that peroration at the end of the origin, where Darwin talks about the most exalted object we're capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, we can trace down, the origin is like an archaeological deposit. You can move down to the earlier incarnations of certain of the sentences in the book. And you find at the lowest level is that e-notebook passage, man is the one great object for which the world was brought into present state, which suggests the kind of teleological structuring that Darwin conceived nature as having evinced. Now, in the last paragraph of the origin, you find that passage, and I think this kind of archaeological layering suggests what is at the bottom of it all. Man's trajectory, that is, and the whole trajectory of nature, is the result of laws, and the laws that he has discriminated: growth with reproduction, inheritance, variability, the struggle for life, and natural selection. Darwin's concept of law is, I think, perfectly typical of what you would find in the 19th century, namely, a law demands a lawgiver. When Darwin was a student at Cambridge, he had to get up, as he said, certain books in order to get a degree. It was not an honors degree, it was the degree a gentleman might take. But he had to read a little William Paley, who was a natural theologian. And that natural theologian did indicate that the world came to be through the establishment of certain laws, and the laws were promulgated by a lawgiver, namely God. These notions of law, which you find in the origin, I think, from that perspective, are quite typical. And what Darwin argues in the origin, which is perfectly palpable, is that these laws act as secondary causes which require a primary cause, namely God, who has established these laws. This, I think, is clear from one of the epigrams, for example, that he takes from another natural theologian, William Ewell, and this is an epigram for the origin of species. But with respect to the material world, we can at least go so far as this. We can perceive that events are brought about not by insulated interpositions of divine power exerted in each particular case, but by the establishment of general law. In the origin, Darwin frequently contrasts his theory against that of natural theologians. But I think if you concentrate, and if you've already read some of the origin, you know this to be the case, or you will know it to be the case, that what Darwin is objecting to is the notion that God intervened at each step to produce this species, then this species, then this species. What he's contending is that all of this comes about by the reason of natural law, which God is ultimately the promulgator of. After the publication of The Origin, Darwin writes his friend Asa Gray here in the United States. Gray was a botanist and a prominent natural theologian. is he said, "I'm inclined to look at everything as resulting from design laws, with the details, whether good or bad, left to the working out of what we may call chance." This was one way in which Darwin was able to, as it were, reconcile his theory with what is, and handle what was one of the great problems since Augustine to the present time, is why is there evil in the world? If the world is the product of a good God, ultimately, how can there be evil? Well, at least the way Darwin begins to conceive it is that God has established laws which indeed are very good, but these laws don't perfectly, as it were, direct a contingent nature. There are things that will happen, as it were, accidentally, and that's the source of evil. At least this seems to be the way Darwin is thinking about it, so that it's really by chance that evil occurs. Darwin, in his autobiography, indicates and says that when I finished writing The Origin of Species, I still believed in an intellectual power governing the world. But that belief dissipated. In a discussion he had toward the end of his life with Edward Aveling. Aveling was the consort of Karl Marx's youngest daughter and himself a biologist. He visited Darwin at his home in Down and discussed with him the problem of the relationship of science and religion. Darwin was curious as why Aveling and his friends thought of themselves as atheists. For Darwin's money, atheists know too much. At this point, in the 1860s, Darwin's faith, which had waned, Darwin said the term that best captures my own views is that of his friend Thomas Henry Huxley, namely agnosticism. He's an agnostic by this time. So Darwin confesses, though, that he lost his belief in Christianity about in the 1850s, probably as a result of the death of his favorite daughter, Annie. But he held on to a rather theistic view until a short time into the 1860s, but then thereafter that faded as well. But I think the point to be stressed and to be brought home is that the construction of his theory in The Origin of Species occurs under the aegis of this larger idea of nature being governed by law and these laws having an intellectual, mental source. Now, let me turn just to a closer examination of the concept of natural selection in Darwin. We usually think of natural selection as a rather simple idea. And in fact, Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's friend, after he read The Origin of Species, literally, virtually hit himself on the head and said, "How stupid of me not to have thought of this first. It just seemed to be so clear." Of course, it took 490 pages in order to make it clear. In the essays of 1842 and 44, Darwin tries to explain how it is that natural selection operates, and he uses the breeder's practice, that is, what we would take to be artificial selection. And he became convinced of the great power of artificial selection. Here is an example of what artificial selection can do. These are pigeons. They have their origin in this common bird that you see begging on the streets here of New York. But with the techniques of the pigeon fancier, you can produce really quite extraordinary animals. Darwin himself started breeding pigeons in the 1850s because he wanted to be assured that animals, as it were plastic and could be molded by selection, and this he certainly demonstrated to himself, and you can see this in the pigeons. He asked himself whether there was in nature any process comparable, and he thinks about what the process might be. He says, is there any means of selecting those offspring which vary in the same manner, crossing them and keeping their offspring separate, and thus producing selected races? Otherwise, as the wild animals freely cross, so must such small heterogeneous varieties be constantly counterbalanced and lost, and a uniformity of character preserved. So what Darwin is worried about here is just this. A breeder will keep a large flock. he will see an animal that has certain traits that appeals to him. He'll select that animal. He'll see another animal that has traits that are comparable, breed them together, and ultimately, through the iteration of that process, you'll produce pigeons of the sort that you just saw. But the question is, what in nature, as it were, performs this function? What brings these animals together? If left to their own devices, as it were, animals would breed with those closest to them. And any incipient favorable traits would be swamped out by breeding with animals that don't have those traits or have, as it were, negative values of those traits. So the question is, what in nature performs this function? Darwin, in his essays, tries to figure out this, and he forms for himself a certain model. And here's the model that you find, say, in the 1844 essay. This is a model for natural selection. He says, let us suppose a being with penetration sufficient to perceive differences in the outer and innermost organizations quite imperceptible to man, and with forethought extending over future centuries to watch with unerring care and select for any object the offspring of an organism produced under the foregoing circumstances. I can see no conceivable reason why he could not form a new race, or several, if he were to separate stock of the original organism and work on several islands adapted to new ends, as we assume his discrimination, his forethought, and his steadiness of object to be incomparably greater than those qualities in man. So we may suppose the beauty and complications of the adaptations of the new race and their differences from the original stock to be greater than in the domestic races produced by man's agency. With time enough, such a being might rationally, without some unknown law opposing him, aim at almost any result. No term comes more trippingly to our lips when talking about natural selection as the mechanism of natural selection. That phrase never came to Darwin's lips. As you can see, the model that he has formed for himself of the operations of natural selection is a model of a supreme intelligence operating. It operates with forethought and discrimination and chooses with unerring care the organisms under which it has intendance. This is a model of mind in nature. It's not a model of a machine-like operation. And when you turn to The Origin of Species, and this is from The Origin itself, you see that Darwin, I won't go through this passage, but it is comparable to the passage that you find in his essays. That is, he has formed for himself a model of the activity of a rational mind. Now, here is another passage from The Origin, and let me just focus on that last phrase. He writes, "It may be said that natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world every variation, even the slightest, rejecting that which is bad, preserving and adding up all that is good, silently and insensibly working whenever and wherever opportunity offers at the improvement of each organic being." That line, that natural selection works for the improvement of each organic being, is, in one form or another, appears several times in The Origin. So here's just, in the penultimate paragraph of The Origin, another example of that. "And as natural selection works solely by and for the good of each being, all corporeal and mental endowments will tend to progress towards perfection." Now, at this point, I'm just going to ask you a question. If you look at that very carefully, and some of you have taken biology courses, what strikes you about that passage? Yes. Are you raising your hand?
He seems to refer to an individual, not to a population.
He's talking about an individual. That's exactly so. Very good.
And we tend to think of evolution as dealing on the population level.
We think of evolution as having, or natural selection having, an effect on the population level. That's certainly true.
Here the implications are that the natural selection will be good. And from a biological standpoint, something that evolves doesn't necessarily have to be good. The way he's coming about it is
Okay, I think you're really right on the right track here, both of you, as a matter of fact. As natural selection works solely by and for the good of each being and each individual, does, as you were beginning to go in that direction, does natural selection, as we understand it, work for the good of each individual? Be brave. Say it. No, I mean, it eliminates most individuals. It destroys most individuals. That's the way we think about natural selection. But Darwin is so imbued with the idea that this is a moral process that he sees natural selection as operating for the good of each individual, or for the, as the previous passage had it, for the improvement of each individual. Actually, what it does is, from our perspective, destroy most individuals, leaving a few standing, as it were. But here he conceives of it rather differently. There's another feature about this. If you've read any of Steve Gould's wonderful essays, and they are indeed wonderful, Gould produced or preached the idea that evolution is not a progressive activity. It doesn't lead to higher beings. That's the way Steve Gould formulates it. But you see, Darwin doesn't think that at all. It leads to the progress toward perfection in corporeal and mental endowments. So this is simply an indication that when you actually read the text and look at it and are not, as it were, reading back in ideas we have from the contemporary period, we see Darwin in a quite different light. Let me just summarize some of these ideas that I've tried to indicate in a very brief way. First of all, natural selection operates, as Darwin conceives it, as a kind of agency and a single force. We think of natural selection as operating, as it were, from a multitude of environmental causal relationships producing its effect. Natural selection operates as an agent with intentional power. And that's the other feature of Darwin's notion of modeling, or at least the way he models natural selection on an intelligent force. If Darwin modeled natural selection on a machine, machines work in a rather desultory way. They don't produce perfection. So the machines that Darwin would have had as examples in the 19th century would not have been something like a Manchester spinning loom. That's not going to produce fine damask. The perfection of the eye probably could not result from any machine-like activity, but an intelligent force could perhaps produce the perfection of the eye. Natural selection prevents back crosses. I won't go into that too much. It shows moral solicitude, and this is an example that I just enunciated. Natural selection produces general progress, which is, again, quite antithetic to our usual view of Darwin's accomplishment, and certainly it's a late 20th century view and 21st century view of the character of evolution. And it has a final goal. At least that's the way I'm suggesting that Darwin initially conceived it. Now, let me just very quickly, and this will be quick, talk about the way Darwin conceives human beings in the Descent of Man. Darwin left the question of human evolution to the 1870s. And one of the characteristics of human beings that he thought he had to explain was, first of all, not man's intelligence. I mean, when we think of our distinction from the animals, we think that, well, we have human reason and animals don't. If you are a British empiricist writing, say, in the 19th century, what do you take reason and intelligence to be? So this is another question I'm going to put to you. So some of you have read maybe John Stuart Mill or James Mill or Jeremy Bentham or David Hume. What would intelligence amount to? Any clues? Well, so the silence is deafening, so I have to give you an answer. He conceives, David Hume, for example, conceives ideas as faint reflections of sensations, and that reasoning is really the association of ideas. And certainly in the early part of the 19th century, that was a common enough view that even natural theologians were wont to ascribe a little bit of reason even to insects, so that the barrier between human beings and animals was not reason. That could be explained. The barrier was morality. That is, human beings were moral. No animal is a moral creature except human beings. So Darwin thought that he really had to explain how morality could evolve. Now, right from the beginning, he starts speculating about how that could be the case. And he tries out a variety of ideas. Nothing is really quite so satisfactory. I mean, one of the characteristics of morality, as Darwin conceived it, it has to be altruistic, acting for the good of another at some expense to self. That's what it is to be moral, as far as Darwin is concerned. So Darwin tries out a lot of ideas. And then in a separate sort of intellectual consideration, he meets a problem in the understanding of the social insects, bees and ants. And here's the problem of the social insects. They have a variety of traits. So if you look at worker ants, for example, there are soldier ants, there are workers, and they have slightly different anatomical characteristics. The same thing with worker bees and soldier bees. They have certain different anatomical characteristics as well as different instincts. Now, the question is, how did natural selection produce those? And I put it to you. What is the problem? Why would Darwin stumble initially in trying to figure out how natural selection worked to produce the anatomical characteristics of, say, worker and soldier bees or worker and soldier ants?
Does it have to do with something where they have characteristics that are either altruistic or not to their benefit?
Well, okay, so the answer he suggested, and indeed this was part of the problem, if what soldier bees do is a marauding bear comes trying to break into the hive, the soldiers go out and sting the bear, and of course what they do in stinging the bear is eviscerate themselves. The stinger comes out as well as their insides, so they die. Well, natural selection works such that if any trait is beneficial to the individual, that individual will be able to pass it on to its offspring. Dying is not a character that is beneficial to the individual. So that's a problem. There's even a more fundamental problem, though, which is, those of you who've had any biology, but even if you haven't had biology, can't hear you. Well, not so much that they're coming from the same hive, but what's characteristic of worker bees and ants?
Well, so like beings within the same species having different instincts?
Not quite.
They can't reproduce.
They're neuters. Exactly. They don't reproduce. But natural selection works on individuals to allow them to reach reproductive age and pass those traits on to their offspring. Neuter bees and ants have no offspring. So how can natural selection operate to produce these anatomical traits or these instincts displayed by the workers and the soldiers in ant nests and beehives? It is perplexing. But you know what the answer is. It's an answer that Darwin struggled with and only at the last minute, as it were, solved, and it's the answer that we accept today. And you get extra credit if you know.
It has to do with kin selection, and so because they're altruistic, the way that they behave makes it more likely that their relatives will be able to reproduce, and their genes get passed on that way.
Okay, basically you've got exactly the right answer. Namely, natural selection works on the whole hive or on the whole nest at one time, because by chance, if that nest has, say, more aggressive bees, just by chance, that nest is going to have a better chance of surviving in a competitive environment than other nests or hives that don't have aggressive bees when the bears come to maraud. And it will survive. New queens will be produced. They'll go off and establish new hives, and those traits will, as it were, disseminate in that fashion, and that will continue and be reiterated over eons. And therefore, those traits will become ever more refined, and we'll have ultimately honeybees and worker bees in the hives and soldiers. So it's that natural selection works on the whole hive or tribe. When Darwin solved this, he also saw how this might apply to human beings. And here is the passage from The Descent of Man that captures it. There can be no doubt that a tribe including many members who, from possessing in a high degree the spirit of patriotism, fidelity, obedience, courage, and sympathy, were always ready to give aid to each other and to sacrifice themselves for the common good, would be victorious over most other tribes, and this would be natural selection. At all times throughout the world, tribes have supplanted other tribes, and as morality is one element in their success, the standard of morality and the number of well-endowed men will thus everywhere tend to rise and increase. The way Darwin conceived it is this, that proto-human beings existed in small clans or tribes. Those tribes and clans which by chance had individuals who were more cooperative would have a better chance of surviving in their environment. And those tribes, as they got larger, would split off, form other groups, and that process would continue. And thereby, in this fashion, you would get altruistic behavior instilled in the human population. Darwin also thought that another kind of evolution, cultural evolution, where learning is passed from group to group over the ages, that would allow people to understand that it's just not this person in this location who's a member of my tribe. It's that group across the river. They're no different than I am. And therefore, the instincts, the social instincts, the altruistic instincts, would be also operative for those others across the river. And that process would continue. And we would, through the growth of intelligence, find what is really at work in helping others. So we'll find out what is really beneficial. In this way, Darwin formulated a theory of morality, which I think one could recommend today. It is a superb theory. So Darwin was that individual of the 19th century. He formulated a theory that had, if we were in a theater, in which we are indeed in a theater, we would say it had legs. It really did perdure. It was the theory that formed the basis of virtually all of modern biology. There are resources in there, particularly Darwin's moral theory, that I think recommends itself for us today. But we have to keep in mind that Darwin was indeed a man of his time. He was a child of the 19th century, and his theory is not necessarily that legatee that we have inherited. It's different from that, but it's because of Darwin's accomplishment that we have modern biology today. Thank you very much.
I'm sure that Professor Richards can field any questions. There are ushers with microphones, so we can hear you all.
So you have, let's see, there's some in the back here.
Okay. I'll let you field.
Yeah, that's fine.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. I was wondering about Darwin's idea of perfection. It seems to me that perfection can only be applied when you have a purpose to achieve. Does he believe in, if he believes in perfection, does he believe in a purpose for the species?
Well, I think Darwin, the concept of perfection is one that Darwin initially begins with. So in his early notebooks, you see him talking about, through the process that he has outlined, perfection being achieved. After all, the vertebrate eye looks like a pretty extraordinary accomplishment. And in Paley's Natural Theology, something that Darwin had to read as a student, Paley uses the eye as the example of a product that can only be attributed to the creator because it is so well designed that there is no other account that can be given except the direct creation by God. Darwin had to argue that it could be created in another fashion through the operation of natural processes. And he lost the notion that perfection was achievable. That is, whatever organism we're talking about could always be better. But he didn't lose the idea that there's a kind of trajectory of improvement. And the vertebrate eye, he was happy to note, Hermann von Helmholtz, a great German physiologist, polymath, in describing the eye, pointed out the imperfections of the eye. And that really satisfied Darwin a great deal because he saw that the eye, while it was extraordinary in its design, nonetheless had imperfections which could be attributed to the actions of nature. So he had a relative notion of perfection, but he did think that, that the natural processes were producing greater progress and perfection. So back there again.
You touched a little bit on Darwin's opinion regarding the evolution of sex, and but you never really sort of came to an answer to his question. And I was just thinking that isn't the current opinion nowadays that in environments that are fluctuating, unstable environments, greater variation in genes means a higher likelihood of survival for a species, and because of the process of sex and meiosis, and the gene pool basically expands, and so in fluctuating environments, it's preferable to have sexually reproducing animals.
Yes, I mean, that is one of the tactics in explaining why sexual generation evolved over long periods of time. The slight problem with that is bacteria do quite well, and they have been around since the beginning. And they have changed a little bit, and they have evolved, but nonetheless, their means of reproduction is quite simple, and it's, for the most part, asexual, although, I'm sure you're going to tell me this, that occasionally they get together and exchange genes, which is something like sexual reproduction. So Darwin thought, when he was trying to, he never himself, I think, solved the problem to his satisfaction, but he did recognize that in clonal reproduction, if accidents happen to an organism, those accidents, that is unfavorable situations, get passed on as well. So there is not the means, as Darwin says, and it's really close to what our contemporary notion is, as you've just explained it, that there's greater possibility of change, there's greater variability, such that that can be utilized. Now, he didn't see that right away, and as it were, the problem of sex sort of dropped out for Darwin. But ultimately, he was moving in the direction, amazingly, that we do today. I had a colleague at the University of Chicago, an eminent evolutionary biologist, who, and I'm sure you will experience this if you go to any of your biology professors, who actually never read The Origin of Species. Now, he had to teach a class, an undergraduate class, which, although it happens occasionally, senior professors in science don't often descend to teach undergraduates. But he did, and he decided that he would assign The Origin of Species, and so he read it for the first time himself. We met each other on the sidewalk in front of the university, and he stopped me and he said, "Bob, you know, old Darwin really knew a lot of biology." Well, he did. Other questions? This is not the common view, the ones I presented to you, that you find of Darwin's accomplishments. So this is, as I say, it's a rather heterogeneous analysis. But you good readers of text presumably will now have ammunition. So there's a question right there to confront those who think otherwise.
How would you respond to the deep ecologist who might say that I believe in the science of evolution, but this discovery of an anthropocentric moral occult in Darwin privileges the human over the non-human, and thus is a kind of ontological violence against nature itself?
Well, I think my response would be, my. Of course, we are interested in that particular animal species of which we are members, and we want to understand as much as we can. I mean, in congressional legislative hearings, you hear some of our more eminent senators and congressmen querying about research in science. And one of, not some time ago now, but one of the queries had to do is why we are giving so much money to study fruit fly genetics. Who in the hell cares about fruit fly genetics? Well, of course, in a certain sense, we don't care about fruit fly genetics. We care about human genetics, but the best way to understand human genetics is to look at fruit flies where the processes are simpler and more easily graspable. So I guess in the same sense, I would say that, look, what we are interested in other animals, but is it a mistake to be even more interested in ourselves and the processes that govern us? We differ from other animals, but one of the ways in which we differ, I think is pretty clear, is that we have a moral structure. And it did seem problematic, and some eminent evolutionary biologists would say that, look, what evolution teaches us is that we are ultimately selfish. We have been produced by natural selection, and natural selection is a selfishly operating principle. It selects those for traits that are beneficial to the individual. It's simply a facade, that kind of moral character that we sometimes parade. We are ultimately selfish. Well, I think Darwin had another perspective on that, and a perspective well worth considering, and I think there's a good deal of empirical evidence in doing studies of human behavior to support that. So to that radical ecologist, I would say, well, sure, we're interested in all sorts of animals, but we're interested in the traits that we exemplify as well, and one of those is moral character.
You stressed the importance of...
Why don't you wait?
Oh, sorry. You've stressed the importance of reading the text carefully and by doing so coming to these conclusions of
A different view of Darwin.
a different view of Darwin. Yeah. Would you say that the neo-Darwinists, the Stephen Gould and the other people that you've mentioned, do you think that is in some way dangerous to the intellectual discourse? What do you think of its effect in a wider, in the wider kind of, the way that people perceive? I mean, it's a bigger question, but what do you think it's doing to?
Well, I had a colleague who some time ago wrote an essay for a prominent scientist, for the journal Science, as a matter of fact. History of science should be X-rated. Because if you really understood the way science worked, and not the way that it's portrayed in, say, the first couple paragraphs of any biology text that you pick up, a science book that you pick up, you would see that it is not as portrayed. We have an ideal of the notion of the way science works, but the way that it actually works is a lot messier. And it's actually quite beneficial to teach neophytes, like yourselves, the ideal, to something to strive for. If they saw the way science actually worked in this messy way, so just to give you a random example, it has been argued that Gregor Mendel, the individual who really gave foundation for our contemporary notion of the gene, Mendel had noticed that there are certain ratios of outcome in the production of hybrid peas. But when you looked at the ratios, the Mendelian ratios that he concluded to, they seemed to be too perfect. They were too good. So the question is, did Mendel sort of fidget with the outcome. That is, did he have already an ideal outcome determined mathematically, and then looked at the empirical outcome and really gave you what the results were of his mathematical demonstration, and not the empirical support for that mathematical demonstration? Well, Gregor Mendel was a monk, and probably he was quite sensitive about honesty, so we'll just give him that. It's very likely, though, that when he was counting p's, so it's important, he was looking at this characteristic, wrinkled p's versus smooth p's. Now, if you're counting, you might say, okay, wrinkled goes in that basket, smooth goes in that one, wrinkled in that, smooth in that. Is this smooth or wrinkled? Well, I know I need a 1:3 ratio. Ah, it's wrinkled. So if that's the way science really does work, and if you've worked in a laboratory, you know there's a lot of massaging of data and so forth. That's not the sort of thing that you want to have as the ideal and the way science operates. So you're willing to provide the ideal. Reading the text of Darwin, that's your original question, that's what you guys have the opportunity of doing. And I have to say that Columbia University, as I mentioned initially, and Chicago are one of the very few major universities where this kind of education is taken so very seriously. And it is the kind of equipment that you are being given that's going to hold you in very good stead later on. It's going to help you read critically and not be taken in by just because some famous or infamous person said X, Y, and Z, are you going to take their word for it? It's going to teach you a kind of critical skepticism, which I think is beneficial for all of us to have. So reading text carefully is going to be a good idea, and it does undermine a little bit the ordinary conception that we've had of Darwin, but you can distinguish Charles Darwin, the individual, from Darwin, the icon. Darwin, the icon, serves many purposes in contemporary biology. I mean, biologists still pay obeisance to that icon. But we have to remember there was a historical Darwin behind that icon. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much.